I just need a place to stay for one night. The Apache woman who became his wife. It was late in the afternoon when the sky began to darken, the sun dipping behind jagged hills that stretched for miles across the frontier. The wind was picking up, carrying with it the smell of dust and dry grass, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The small town at the edge of the prairie was quiet, almost empty, except for a few people moving quickly to get home before the storm hit. Among the travelers arriving in town that day was a man who had been walking for hours along the muddy trail. His clothes were worn, his boots heavy with mud, and his face carried a mix of exhaustion and weariness. He did not know anyone in the town, and he had no home to rest in for the night. All he knew was that he needed shelter, even if it was just for one night. He passed the small wooden houses in the general store, his eyes scanning for any sign of welcome. Most of the windows were dark, and the doors were firmly closed against the approaching storm. He began to feel a sense of urgency, a need to find a safe place before the rain became heavier. Just as he began to lose hope, he noticed a small cabin at the far end of the street. Smoke rose slowly from the chimney, curling into the gray sky. The cabin was modest but seemed sturdy, built of logs with a small porch in front. A feeling of relief washed over him. Perhaps someone inside would offer him a place to stay, if only for the night. Inside the cabin, a woman moved quietly, her eyes alert as she prepared for the storm. She was Apache, with long dark hair pulled back from her face and skin kissed by the sun. Her life had been shaped by the land she grew up on and the hardships she had faced, but she carried herself with strength and quiet confidence. She was used to living independently, taking care of herself in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. The wind outside rattled the wooden walls of the cabin, and she moved to close the shutters, securing the small space against the rain. It was then that she noticed a figure approaching through the mist of rain. A man soaked and tired walking steadily toward her home. The man stopped at the edge of the porch, raising a hand in greeting. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a little rough from exhaustion. I just need a place to stay for one night." "Please." There was something in his tone that told her he was sincere, that he meant no harm. For a moment, she hesitated.
It was unusual for strangers to appear, especially in a time and place where people were careful about who they welcomed.
But there was also a part of her that understood the need for kindness, the small gestures that could make a world of difference in someone's life.
She opened the door wider, gesturing for him to enter.
"Come in," she said simply. "You can stay here tonight." But only tonight. The man nodded, gratitude playing on his face. He stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat and boots, and the warmth of the cabin immediately enveloped him. The scent of firewood and herbs filled the air. Comforting in its familiarity, it was a simple space, with a small hearth, a few wooden chairs, and a bed tucked into the corner. But it was safe, and in that moment, it was enough. As the storm began to batter the roof and windows, the two of them settled into the quiet of the cabin. The man warmed his hands by the fire while the woman returned to her chores, tending to a small pot of stew simmering on the hearth. Neither spoke much at first. The silence was not uncomfortable, but instead carried a sense of cautious respect. Both were aware of the differences between them. The man, a traveler from outside the territory, and the woman, rooted in her Apache heritage. But yet, in the shared space of the cabin, there was a fragile connection forming, built on trust and the simple need for safety. The man began to tell small fragments of his story. He had been traveling for weeks, moving from town to town, searching for work and a place to belong. Life on the frontier was hard, and loneliness often weighed heavily on him. He spoke of the challenges he had faced, of nights spent under the stars without shelter, and of the people he had met along the way, some kind and some not. The woman listened quietly, nodding occasionally, her eyes thoughtful. She had heard stories like his before, from other travelers and settlers, and from the elders in her own community. She understood the hardships of life in this land, and there was a part of her that admired his persistence, his determination to keep moving despite the difficulties. When he finished speaking, she offered him a small bowl of the stew she had been preparing.
"Eat," she said, her voice gentle. "It will warm you."
He accepted, grateful, and for a moment the room was filled with the simple act of sharing a meal.
There was no pretense, no expectation, beyond the kindness they had shown each other. The fire crackled softly, and the rain continued to fall outside, creating a rhythm that seemed to slow time itself. As the evening wore on, they talked more, not just of hardships but of life, of hopes, and of memories. The man spoke of his family, who lived far away and whom he had not seen in years. The woman shared stories of her childhood, of the lessons she had learned from her parents, and the traditions she cherished. There was a sense of learning from each other, of crossing boundaries without fully realizing it. They began to see each other not just as stranger and guest, but as human beings navigating a world that often demanded resilience and courage. The storm outside grew stronger, the wind howling through the trees and the rain drumming on the roof. Yet inside the cabin there was a growing sense of comfort. The man realized that for the first time in weeks he felt safe. The woman too felt a small sense of peace, knowing that she had done a good thing by offering shelter. It was a reminder that even in a harsh and unpredictable world, small acts of kindness could create a sense of hope. Night fell fully, and the man prepared to rest. The woman showed him the bed in the corner, simple but clean, and he thanked her quietly before settling down. She watched him for a moment, noting the lines of fatigue on his face, before returning to the hearth to keep the fire alive. Though neither could have known it at the time, that night marked the beginning of a connection that would change both of their lives. A single night of shelter, offered without expectation, had opened the door to trust, understanding, and something deeper than either could have anticipated. As he drifted off to sleep, listening to the rain against the window, he felt a sense of gratitude that went beyond words. The storm outside raged on, but inside the cabin there was warmth, safety, and a quiet companionship. The woman, sitting by the fire, reflected on the choice she had made to open her door. She knew that in a world full of uncertainty, even small decisions could carry weight. That night, a stranger had become more than just a traveler seeking shelter. He had become a witness to her kindness, and she, in turn, had become a part of his story. The hours passed slowly, the rain eventually easing to a gentle drizzle, and the first light of dawn began to filter through the shutters. The man woke feeling rested, a rare feeling for someone who had spent so many nights on the road. He looked around the cabin, appreciating the warmth and the safety it had provided. The woman greeted him with a nod, offering a simple breakfast of bread and tea. There were no grand gestures, no promises, only the quiet acknowledgement of the night they had shared. When it came time for him to leave, he hesitated, not wanting to break the fragile bond that had formed. The woman gave him a small smile, understanding that their paths might cross again, though neither could know when or how. They parted with gratitude and respect, carrying with them the memory of a night in which two strangers had found a connection that transcended differences, fear, and the unpredictability of life on the frontier. That night of shelter had been more than just a place to sleep. It had been an encounter that planted the seeds of trust and companionship. For the man, it was a reminder that even in a world full of hardships, there were moments of kindness that could change everything. For the woman, it was a reminder that opening her door to someone in need could create ripples far beyond the walls of her small cabin. Neither could have imagined at the time that a single night's hospitality would become the beginning of a story that would shape both of their lives forever. The days following the storm were calm but filled with quiet energy. The man did not leave immediately after the night of shelter. Something in him, a feeling he could not quite explain, made him stay a little longer. The woman noticed this, but she said nothing, Life in the frontier required careful observation, and she had learned long ago not to rush decisions or speak too quickly. Instead, she went about her daily tasks, tending to her small garden and caring for the few animals she kept near the cabin. Yet she was aware of his presence, a subtle awareness that grew with each passing day. The man helped where he could. He carried water from the nearby stream, gathered firewood, and repaired the small fence that surrounded the garden. He did not offer explanations for his stay beyond what was necessary, and she did not ask. Instead, their relationship developed slowly, like two people walking side by side along a narrow trail, each learning the steps of the other's rhythm. They shared chores, and in the shared work a quiet bond began to form. There was no need for words. The acts themselves were enough to communicate respect and trust. When the sun was high and the heat pressed down on the earth, they would sit in the shade of a tree, resting and talking. Their conversations started small, often about the land, the weather, or simple observations of daily life. But as the days passed, the man began to speak of things deeper than survival, his hopes, the life he had dreamed of, and the hardships that had brought him to this place. The woman listened, her eyes steady, her expressions calm but thoughtful. She had heard many stories of travelers and settlers, but something about his honesty and quiet strength made her feel a connection she had not expected.
In turn, she shared parts of her own life.
She spoke of her childhood in the Apache community, of the lessons her parents had taught her, and the ways she had learned to navigate a world that often demanded strength and courage. She did not reveal everything. Some stories were private, sacred, or too painful, but the pieces she did share allowed the man to see her as more than the woman who had offered him shelter. She was strong, capable, and wise, yet human in every sense, with fears, dreams, and desires of her own. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills again, they heard a distant sound, a group of men approaching the cabin. The woman's hand instinctively moved toward the doorframe, her body tense. The frontier was a place where strangers could bring trouble as easily as help, and she had learned to be cautious. The man noticed her reaction and stepped forward slightly, his own instincts alert. The men stopped at the edge of the property, calling out, their voices rough but not immediately threatening. They were settlers from the town, curious about the cabin at the edge of the land. The woman stepped forward, calm but firm, to greet them. Breaths. She introduced herself and explained that the man was merely a guest, staying for a short time. The men nodded, some skeptical, but they did not linger long. The encounter ended without incident, but it reminded both of them of the fragile nature of safety in their world. That night, as the fire crackled and the wind whispered through the trees, the man reflected on the day's events.
He realized that his presence in her life was not without consequences. They were two people from very different worlds, and yet their lives had intersected in a way that could not easily be undone.
He wondered if he had overstepped by staying so long, and whether the bond they were forming was wise or even possible in a world that often judged too quickly. The woman, meanwhile, felt a mixture of emotions. She had offered shelter with no expectation beyond kindness, yet she could not deny that a sense of connection had grown between them. It was a connection built on shared experience, trust, and the understanding that each had found a rare sense of safety with the other. But she also knew that the outside world, with its rules and prejudices, would not easily accept their growing relationship.
It was a thought that made her cautious, but it did not diminish the feeling that had begun to take root in her heart.
For the following days, their routine settled into a rhythm. They worked together, ate together, and shared stories in the evenings. The man began to teach her some of the skills he had learned on his travels. How to identify useful plants, how to repair tools more efficiently, and ways to conserve food for the winter months. In return, she taught him the knowledge she had gained from her own community, the ways to read the land, how to move quietly and safely through the forest, and how to understand the patterns of animals and weather. Each lesson deepened their respect for one another, revealing not only practical skills but also the ways in which their lives had shaped them. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, the man asked her a question he had been holding back. "Do you ever wonder," he began slowly, what it would be like if we didn't have to leave this place. If we could just stay? The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. She looked at him, her eyes steady and thoughtful.
She had considered the same question in her own mind, though she had not dared to speak it aloud.
I have thought about it, she said quietly.
But life is not simple. There are rules and expectations in both of our worlds.
Rationed. And yet, I cannot deny that I feel something here. Something I did not expect. The man nodded, understanding that her words were not a promise but a recognition of the bond that was growing between them. It was a bond that went beyond words, beyond culture, beyond the simple act of hospitality that had brought them together in the first place. Ah! The next challenge came unexpectedly. A sudden illness struck one of the animals she kept, a horse that had been her companion for years. She worked tirelessly to care for it. But despite her efforts, the animal's condition worsened. The man, seeing her struggle, stepped in without hesitation. Together they tended to the horse, following each other's instructions and instincts. The experience brought them closer, not only because of the shared work, but because it revealed their ability to trust and rely on one another in times of need. Through these small challenges, the bond between them strengthened. They learned to anticipate each other's thoughts and actions, to respect each other's space and independence, and to recognize the courage and resilience that each brought to their shared life. There was laughter, too, in the quiet moments. The kind of laughter that comes from simple joys, from the relief of overcoming difficulties, and from the discovery of common ground in a world that often seemed divided. Past. The man began to feel less like a visitor and more like a part of her world. He learned the rhythms of the land, the patterns of the weather, and the subtle signs that indicated change. The woman, too, began to see him not merely as a traveler but as someone who could be trusted, someone whose presence had become a part of her daily life. They were careful not to speak too loudly of the future, knowing that such thoughts could be fragile, but the sense of connection was undeniable. One evening, as the sky turned purple with the fading light, they sat together outside the cabin, watching the stars begin to appear. The man reached out, gently touching her hand.
It was a simple gesture, but it carried with it a weight of unspoken understanding.
Neither spoke at first, allowing the silence to convey the feelings that words could not. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but steady. "We have found something rare here," she said. "Something worth protecting." He nodded, understanding her meaning. The bond they had formed was fragile in many ways, but it was also strong. It was built on trust, respect, and the recognition that they had both found a safe place with each other. It was a bond that could face challenges, but it could also bring comfort, hope, and perhaps even love. As night fell fully, they returned inside the cabin, the fire warming their faces and the wind outside carrying only distant echoes of the storm that had brought them together. They shared a simple meal, speaking of ordinary things, but the sense of connection lingered in the quiet moments between words. They knew that the days ahead would bring challenges, that the world outside would not always understand or accept what they were building together. Yet they also knew that the night of shelter had been the beginning of something important, a chance to see each other as more than strangers, to recognize the value of trust and kindness, and to discover the possibility of a bond that could grow despite the odds. And so, their lives continued, intertwined by circumstance, choice, and the quiet moments that revealed the depth of their understanding. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to strengthen the connection that had begun with a simple act of kindness. The storm that had forced the man to seek shelter had also brought him to a place where he could find not only safety but a companion who shared his values, his strength, and, perhaps most importantly, his humanity. In the end, Part 2 was not about grand events or dramatic confrontations. It was about the slow, steady growth of trust and connection, about the way two people from very different worlds could find common ground, and about the moments of understanding that quietly, but powerfully, shaped the course of their lives. The bond they were forming was a foundation, strong enough to face challenges yet fragile enough to require care, patience, and respect. And as the days turned to weeks, they both began to understand that this connection, born from a single night of shelter, was something that neither of them had expected, but both had come to treasure deeply. The weeks that followed were full of routine, yet beneath the calm surface, both the man and the Apache woman felt the growing tension of choices that had yet to be made. Life in the cabin had become familiar. Each knew the rhythm of the other's day, the small habits and gestures that signaled thought or emotion. But outside forces began to weigh more heavily. The frontier was not a forgiving place, and neither the man nor the woman could ignore the reality that their bond, as strong as it had grown, existed in a world that often judged harshly and quickly.
It started with whispers in the town.
Just immense his time with the woman and began to murmur among themselves. Curiosity soon turned into suspicion. People asked questions, and though no one confronted them directly, the air carried the quiet judgment of a community wary of crossing cultural boundaries.
The man felt it first as unease, a prickling at the back of his mind whenever he passed someone on the street.
The woman noticed it as well, in the sideways glances and cautious nods of neighbors who had once greeted her warmly.
One morning, the man stood at the edge of the garden sharpening a tool while the woman tended the small plants.
He paused, looking out at the hills beyond the cabin, and spoke quietly. "Do you ever wonder if we're asking for too much?" His voice carried a weight she had not heard before. She looked at him, her hands resting on the earth, her eyes steady. "I think about it," she admitted. "But what we have, it's rare. We cannot control what others think, only how we act." He nodded, appreciating her wisdom, but he could not ignore the fear that grew quietly in his chest. As if to test their resolve, a letter arrived one day for the man. It was from his family, written months earlier but only recently delivered. The words were filled with longing and concern, asking him to return home. They did not understand why he had chosen this remote life, nor did they know about the bond he had formed with the Apache woman. Reading the letter, he felt a pull he had not expected, a tug between the life he had known and the life that was slowly unfolding before him.
He set the letter aside, unsure what to do, feeling the weight of two worlds pressing upon him at once.
But the woman noticed the change in him immediately. He had become quieter, lost in thought, and she sensed the internal struggle that he had not yet voiced. She did not press him, understanding that such decisions required time and reflection. Instead, she continued her work, offering silent support and understanding. There were moments when she wondered if he would leave, if the connection they had built could survive the pressures from outside. But there was also a quiet hope that their bond, forged in trust and kindness, might withstand the challenges yet to come. Life continued with its small challenges and moments of intimacy. The man helped repair the cabin's roof before the next rain, and they worked together to improve the garden, ensuring there would be food for the coming months. They laughed at small mistakes, shared quiet meals, and took long walks along the edge of the hills, speaking of dreams and stories. Yet each evening, the unspoken question lingered. What would happen when the realities of the world outside could no longer be ignored? Then, one day, a messenger arrived from the woman's community.
It was a quiet morning, the sun rising slowly, when she saw the figure approaching from the trail.
He carried a message, one that required her presence beyond the safety of the cabin. Her heart tightened with concern, knowing that this might be the moment when her two worlds collided. She spoke to the man, her voice calm but serious. "I must go," she said. "They need me to answer for my actions. For having you here."
The man's face reflected a mix of worry and understanding.
But he knew this moment would come. He had feared it, and yet he could not stop it. She traveled back to her community, the man walking beside her for a while before the path split. Desk. He watched her go, feeling a strange emptiness in the quiet that followed. The journey was not long, but it was heavy with tension. She knew that the elders would question her choices, that some might see her hospitality and continued closeness with the man as a violation of tradition, and she knew that she had to answer honestly, without hiding the truth of the bond they had formed. Birth, she was greeted by serious faces, elders who had lived long enough to see the world change, but still clung to the rules that had guided their lives. They questioned her gently at first, asking about her time at the cabin and the man who had been staying there. She spoke carefully, telling them the truth, that he had come seeking shelter in a storm, that she had offered it without expectation, and that over the weeks, a bond of trust and respect had grown between them. Round, and understanding the value of kindness and the strength of character required to make such a choice. Others frowned, questioning the wisdom of allowing a stranger into her life for so long. The discussion was measured, respectful, but it was clear that her actions would be remembered and judged. She remained calm, explaining that she had acted from her heart, that she had sought to do what was right, not reckless, and that the bond they shared had grown naturally from a single act of compassion. Meanwhile, the man waited at the cabin, tending to the garden and reflecting on the weeks that had passed. He thought about the lessons he had learned, the trust they had built, and the strength she had shown in every challenge. He knew that their connection was no longer a simple act of hospitality. It had become something deeper, something worth defending, even if it required patience and courage. After several days, the woman returned, the elders having given her a cautious blessing, acknowledging both her judgment and the unusual circumstances that had brought the man to her cabin.
When she returned, she found him waiting with quiet anticipation.
Their eyes met, and in that moment all doubts and fears seemed to ease, replaced by a renewed sense of understanding and shared purpose. They embraced, not just in greeting but in the recognition that they had survived the first true challenge to their bond. But life was not without further trials. News of trouble in the town began to reach them. Disputes between settlers, tensions over land, and rumors that their growing relationship had been noticed. The man and the woman realized that staying together openly would bring more scrutiny, more judgment, and potential conflict. They had to consider how to navigate these pressures while preserving the bond they had built. The man suggested making plans to travel together to a safer location, but the woman insisted on caution. The land they knew was familiar, and though challenges existed, it offered a level of safety and control they could not easily find elsewhere. Brass. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the woman spoke of her fears. "I know the world outside this cabin may not accept us," she said softly, "but I also know that what we have here is rare. We must decide how much we are willing to risk for it." The man took her hand, feeling the warmth and strength in her grip. "I am willing to face what comes," he replied. "If we are together, it will be worth it." They sat in silence, the fire crackling between them, both understanding that the choices ahead would not be easy, but necessary for the life they wanted to build. The following days were filled with preparations. They repaired the cabin further, ensuring it could withstand the coming storms. They stored food, strengthened fences, and made plans for emergencies. Each act was a testament to their growing commitment to one another, a silent promise that they would face the world together, no matter the challenges. There were moments of doubt, small disagreements, and fears of what might happen, but each time they returned to the shared understanding that had brought them together. Then the final challenge arrived in the form of a harsh winter storm. Rye snow fell heavily across the hills, and the wind carried an icy bite that tested both their endurance and their resourcefulness. They worked side by side, maintaining the fire, securing food, and caring for the animals. The storm was relentless, but in the quiet moments between efforts, they found warmth in each other's presence. The hardship of the storm reminded them of the strength they had both developed over years of living in a harsh world, and of the importance of their bond in facing challenges that were greater than either could handle alone. When the storm finally passed, the landscape was transformed. The hills were blanketed in snow, the trees sparkling with frost, and the sky clear and pale blue. The man and the woman stepped outside, taking in the scene. It was beautiful, and yet it was also a reminder that the world was always changing, always unpredictable. They returned to the cabin, strengthened by what they had endured, and realized that their connection had not only survived challenges, but had grown stronger because of them. In those quiet moments, they began to speak openly about the future. They discussed the possibility of building a life together, not just surviving side by side, but sharing dreams, responsibilities, and hopes. They knew that the journey ahead would be filled with choices and compromises, but they were willing to face it together. The bond that had started with a single night of shelter had grown into something more profound, a recognition that love, trust, and understanding could bridge worlds, cultures, and uncertainties. By the end of part 3, both the man and the woman understood that their relationship was no longer defined by circumstance alone. It had become a deliberate choice, a conscious commitment to face the challenges of life together. The decisions ahead would be difficult, and the world outside their cabin would continue to test them. Yet the strength they had developed, the trust they had built, and the deep understanding of one another gave them confidence that they could face whatever came next, together. The first light of morning broke over the hills, casting a soft glow across the snow-covered landscape. The man and the Apache woman stepped outside the cabin, breathing in the crisp air. The world seemed quiet, as if it too were holding its breath, waiting for the next step in their lives. After the challenges they had faced, storms, suspicion from neighbors, and the weight of tradition, they now stood together, knowing that the choices ahead would shape not only their future, but the life they wanted to build as a pair. For weeks, they had spoken quietly of the possibilities, weighing each decision with care. They knew that if they chose to remain together openly, they would face continued scrutiny and questions from both the townspeople and the woman's community. Yet, the bond that had grown from a single night of shelter was stronger than any fear or uncertainty. It was a bond built on trust, respect, and shared experiences that neither could ignore. The man turned to her, his eyes steady. "We have faced storms, challenges, and doubts," he said softly. "I do not want to live another day without knowing that we face the future together." She looked at him, a quiet smile on her lips. "I feel the same," she replied. "We cannot control the world outside, but we can choose what we do with our lives, here and now." Her words carried both certainty and hope. It was a moment of clarity for both of them, a recognition that the life they had begun to build together deserved a conscious commitment. They spent the following days preparing for the change that their decision required. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a home. They repaired the roof and walls, made sure the garden could provide enough food for the coming seasons, and stored supplies in case of future storms. Each task was done side by side, not just as a necessity, but as a statement of partnership. In these moments, small acts became meaningful. Fetching water, tending the fire, and repairing tools were no longer chores but symbols of shared responsibility and mutual respect. The townspeople continued to watch, curiosity giving way to cautious acceptance. Some approached with questions, while others simply observed from a distance. The couple responded with quiet confidence, demonstrating through action rather than words that their bond was built on respect and care. Slowly, perceptions began to change. The man's honesty, his willingness to work, and his respect for the woman's knowledge and traditions earned him a place in the community, even if it was a quiet and tentative one. Within the woman's community, too, attitudes softened. The elders who had once questioned her decisions acknowledged the strength and wisdom she had shown. They had seen her act with care, consider consequences, and maintain her integrity while forming a bond with someone from outside her world. Their cautious acceptance allowed her to move forward with a sense of confidence, knowing that her choices had been guided by both heart and reason. As spring approached, they began to think seriously about their future. They spoke openly about marriage, not as a ritual or formality, but as a commitment to live together, to face challenges together, and to honor the trust they had built. They discussed how to blend their lives, balancing traditions and practicalities, while maintaining respect for their individual histories and values. But each conversation strengthened their connection, building a foundation of understanding and mutual respect that would carry them through life's uncertainties. One afternoon, while walking along the trail near the cabin, the man spoke of his feelings. "I do not want to imagine a life without you," he said. "I want to build something that lasts, not just survive, but thrive together."
The woman paused, considering his words.
"I feel the same," she replied. "It will not be simple, and there will be challenges. But what we have is worth every effort."
They held hands, walking in silence for a while, letting the words settle and become real. Preparations for their marriage were humble but meaningful.
They combined traditions, drawing from her Apache heritage and his frontier customs. Close friends and family from both sides came to witness the union, creating a quiet celebration that reflected both cultures. There was no grand hall or lavish feast, only sincerity, laughter, and the warmth of people who cared. The ceremony itself was simple. Vows spoken with honesty, promises made with intention, and blessings shared freely. Each element symbolized not just their love, but the respect and trust that had grown over many weeks of shared life. After the ceremony, they returned to their cabin, now officially a home in every sense. Life continued with its small routines, but now there was a sense of permanence and security. They shared mornings tending the garden, afternoons working on repairs, and evenings by the fire, speaking of dreams, memories, and the possibilities ahead. Each day reinforced the bond they had chosen to honor, each act of cooperation a reminder that love and partnership were as much about action as they were about feeling. Winter came again, bringing with it cold nights and snow-covered hills. But the couple faced it together, prepared by experience and strengthened by the life they had built. They managed the fire, cared for the animals, and ensured that the cabin remained safe and warm. Challenges that might have seemed daunting alone became manageable because they faced them as a team. Even the harshest storms could not shake the foundation they had built, a foundation of trust, understanding, and mutual support. Over time, the couple's story became known in both the town and her community, not as a tale of scandal, but as a testament to resilience and kindness. Their decision to stay together despite differences and expectations inspired others to consider the value of empathy, understanding, and courage. Neighbors who had once been skeptical grew to respect the man for his honesty and work ethic, and the woman's community saw that her choices, guided by compassion and wisdom, had strengthened her life rather than weakened it. The years that followed were filled with quiet achievements and shared joys. They built a stronger home, expanded the garden, and cultivated a small orchard. They welcomed children into their lives, teaching them the lessons they had learned: respect for the land, courage in the face of challenges, and the importance of trust and honesty in relationships. The cabin became a center of life, laughter, and learning, a place where love was expressed not through grand gestures, but through the daily acts of care, attention, and commitment. Even in moments of difficulty, they relied on each other. Illness, accidents, or natural challenges were faced together, each drawing on the strengths of the other. Their partnership became a model of resilience, showing that differences in background, culture, or experience need not divide people, but can instead enrich a shared life when approached with respect and understanding. The man often reflected on the night he had first arrived at the cabin, drenched and weary, asking only for shelter. He remembered the woman's quiet generosity, the warmth of the fire, and the simple act of kindness that had started it all. That night, which had seemed so small and fleeting at the time, had become the beginning of a life full of love, trust, and shared adventure. The woman, too, thought often of that first night. She realized that by opening her door, she had created not just safety for a stranger, but a path to a future rich with partnership, understanding, and love. As the sun set each evening over the hills, casting long shadows across the cabin and garden, they would sit together on the porch, watching the world in quiet contentment. The wind carried the scent of the land, the distant call of birds, and the gentle rustle of leaves. These moments of calm were a reminder that life was not always easy, but when faced together, every challenge could be met, every obstacle overcome. By the time they were older, the cabin had grown into a home filled with memories, love, and lessons passed from one generation to the next. Their story, which had begun with a single night of shelter, had become a life of shared dreams, deep respect, and enduring connection. They had built something far greater than a home. They had built a life defined by courage, kindness, and the decision to face the world together, no matter what came. In the end, the man and the woman understood that their journey had been extraordinary, not because of grand events or dramatic moments, but because of the quiet strength of their commitment to one another. A single act of kindness had transformed both their lives, leading to trust, partnership, and love. They had learned that true connection often begins in unexpected ways, and that the choices we make with care and courage can shape a life far beyond what we ever imagine. And so, as they watched the sun sink behind the hills, hand in hand, they felt a quiet satisfaction and peace. The frontier, once harsh and uncertain, had become a place of safety, home, and shared life. The bond they had forged endured, proving that love, respect, and understanding could bridge worlds, survive storms, and create a future rich with hope and happiness. The night of shelter that had brought them together remained in their hearts, a symbol of the power of simple kindness to change lives forever.